Next up, it's my great pleasure to introduce Greg West. Greg will be leading a couple of conversations here that really kind of kicks off some of the work that we've been doing across the region to much anticipation, specifically around the business case for resilience. So Greg is the CEO of ZOM Living. Greg, all yours.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And thank you to all of you for joining in with us this afternoon and this morning. I am, Steve said, the CEO of ZOM Living. I'm also the immediate past chair of the ULI District Council in Southeast Florida and the Caribbean. I'm a board member of the Miami Downtown Development Authority. I'm a member of the ULI Global Advisory Board for the Center of Sustainability and Economic Performance. I'm a global governing trustee at ULI, and I'm a member of the Americas Executive Committee at ULI. So as you can tell, my involvement in ULI runs deep. I'm really honored and proud to be part of such an organization as ULI that plays such an important role in convening discussion and study between on such an important topic that bridges both the governmental interests and the private interests as well. Neither party can solve alone the challenges that are so dynamic as sea level rise. And in Southeast Florida, we are absolutely vulnerable to coastal hazards. We see sunny day flooding from tidal movements, and storms sometimes remind us of where we are really most vulnerable in our community. It's critical that we all, both on the private and public sector, start asking ourselves very difficult questions. What vulnerabilities and threats will we experience in the future? What are the costs and benefits of different adaptation actions? What actions can be taken today? To start a conversation around these questions, the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact and a coalition of local partners from the business community commissioned the ULI Business Case for Resilience in Southeast Florida project. The final report is being launched today and is based on regional economic assessment conducted by AECOM. The report finds that there is a clear shared interest among all stakeholders to take action and identifies an opportunity for the real estate industry to achieve a positive ROI for investing in both building and community level adaptation. To safeguard investments, now is the time for the real estate industry to coordinate with the public sector on resilience planning initiatives and co-create new models for partnerships, policy, and funding to help the region to continue to thrive. Today, I'm joined by our technical leads from AECOM, as well as peers from the local business community to further explain the analysis and how these findings are relevant to all stakeholders in the region. So from here, I'll turn it over to Annie and Aaron from AECOM to share their findings.
Great, thank you so much, Greg. It's an honor to be able to have a platform in this summit today, and I want to just reiterate what Greg and other people have said throughout the day, but just hats off work to the organizing committee for setting this up. And I also want to extend my thanks to ULI for their leadership on this study, as well as Brazaga, and the manner in which they played on the ground connections with many stakeholders. And lastly, I want to just extend my thanks to the Compact partners and other public and private sector partners who expended a lot of time and financial resources to ensure this study was able to come together over the last year. Let's go to the next slide. Great. So Greg touched on this, but fundamentally the goal of this study was to determine if there is a return on investment from different measures that could help mitigate current and future coastal hazard risks in Southeast Florida. Based on the findings of our analysis, I'm happy to report that the models and related assumptions support that there is a regional business case for resilience in Southeast Florida. We looked at a couple different types of adaptation buckets that could be implemented to help mitigate coastal hazards now in the future, both building level and community-wide approaches. Based on this analysis, and I'm going to talk a little more about the nuances to these numbers in a few slides, there is an overwhelming benefit ranging from every dollar you invest in adaptation to providing $2 to $4 of social benefits. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this just shows the general study process that guided our work. We started by trying to understand what the existing and future vulnerabilities are in Southeast Florida to a range of high frequency coastal hazards. From there, once we understood what types of assets and parcels were at risk, we undertook an evaluation to determine both the costs of doing nothing, as well as the costs and benefits of investing in adaptation and resilience. Additionally, some of these analyses can be pretty nuanced and just slightly infeasible to carry out at such a large regional scale. To that end, we also have conducted some additional qualitative considerations about other co-benefits that can be conveyed by adaptation. And lastly, we all know this, it takes a lot of time and planning to implement resilience and adaptation projects. So the third and final part of our analysis was to develop recommendations that really just encourage and promote the Southeast Florida region to continue to invest in their institutions, their infrastructure solutions, and their people. And those are all actions that can be taken now and don't have to wait for some level of environmental approval or financial match, et cetera. Also, before I dive into the different analyses that we undertook, I just want to stress that this is a high-level regional analysis. I think you could imagine the number of properties that we evaluated to ensure that we could complete the analysis and have it presentable for these forums and others. We took a lot of effort to leverage ready available regional data that is standardized from both physical and economic dimension, so we could have comparable analyses. Additionally, we rely on replicable analysis techniques and incorporate generalized assumptions where needed to kind of advance the findings across the entire region. Next slide, please. So I'm not here to be pedantic and talk about the risks about sea level rise and the mechanics. I believe everyone part of the summit knows so much about this compared to the average citizen and in Florida or elsewhere. And so I just want to touch on the different types of physical data and approaches that we use to inform our analysis. When we model both current and future risks, we are focused on understanding how water levels will change over time based on rising sea levels. To do this, we based our evaluation of exposure and economic and fiscal impacts to the unified compact projections that were updated at the end of 2019. In particular, we looked at two discrete timeframes, 2040 and 2070, where you have approximately 17 and 40 inches of sea level rise from the year 2000. The reason we chose these planning horizons relate to compact's general infrastructure considerations around investments that will last 50 years or longer. The basic schematics that you see in the middle just reflect what we already know. As sea level rises over time, there will be increasing amounts of property and other valuable assets that are at risk to water levels and coastal storms. So in 2040, as you see on the left, we've got less at risk, and the investment to protect that risk is less than what would be expected moving into the future. You also see daily high tide on the top, and below it coastal hazard. I want to direct your attention to the right of this slide. We modeled three types of high frequency events. So these are events that are very likely to occur annually, if not more frequently in the future. The three events that we evaluate are mean high or high water, which is the average of the highest of the two high tides occurring each day. We also refer to this as daily tidal inundation. We also evaluate a one-year tide, which is commonly referred to as a king tide and has a chance of occurring every year. And we also looked at a 10-year tide, which has a 10% chance of occurring in any given year. Can we go to the next slide? Great. So this slide gets into the actual quantitative analysis that we undertook. I mentioned those different sea level rise planning horizons that we incorporated in different storm frequencies. To generate an understanding of what is exposed to those different scenarios, we were able to access regional data that was prepared by the University of Florida's Sea Level Scenario Sketch Planning tool. Basically provides GIS inundation layers that account for different water levels as well as different points in the future. So we were able to get that regionally standardized data and overlay it on other standardized data such as county assessor data, as well as data from the Florida Department of Revenue. Key to this analysis is illustrating that there's different types of impacts, and I think we all know this. There's temporary storm impacts, as well as more permanent impacts from sea level rise over time. And based on those types of risks, one being more chronic and one being more continual stress over time, it may necessitate different types of adaptation responses. When we undertook the analysis and in collaboration with the compact partners, we were trying to strike a balance to look at a variety of different types of economic and fiscal impacts that illuminate the interdependencies that exist between the public and private sector. So we evaluated direct property impacts, which for storms, to look at structure and content damage, displacement and relocation costs. Because if a business, for example, is damaged by a storm, in many cases will have to temporarily shut down, which results in lost sales and lost income and associated job impacts, which are relevant to a wide range of audiences. And lastly, if businesses aren't able to operate continually, and or if property is at risk of damage, this results in fiscal impacts. Public sector relies heavily on sales taxes, tourist development taxes, and property taxes to fund their operations, including investments in resilience. So there's really just a feedback loop when a risk does it present itself and it's not addressed. It can have impacts on a variety of partners, as we all know. I just want to mention that the unique difference of the presentation of permanent sea level rise damages from daily high tides is that we embrace the assumption in this analysis that it's something that is exposed to a high tide daily over a large portion of a parcel is likely to be a functionally an asset that lacks functionality from both an operating perspective or a safety perspective. And so we evaluate property impacts slightly different for permanent sea level rise, as we assume that these properties would be taken off the task roll and could result in long-term both business and employment impacts as well as fiscal impacts. Can we go to the next slide? So what you see on this slide is just an overview, a high-level overview of some of the different impacts we evaluated based on the 2040 sea level rise scenario. I want to stress two things. First, we are imposing these superimposing these future conditions or physical conditions on the existing built environment. So this is basically a representation of how much current economic assets and activity are at risk to these future water levels. Additionally, there was a note on the last slide, but I want to reinforce that we had to make assumptions about what threshold is reached when a property is at risk to storm and permanent sea level rise impacts. So we did not have building footprint data across the region, so we had to rely on data from Department of Revenue about the size of buildings and parcel footprints to do some evaluation. And based on that evaluation, we saw a large number of assets. Structures are generally take up 50+ more % of the parcel area. And so we have some thresholds about what actually triggers damage. To get to the results, what you'll see is that there's a lot of property that is at risk from sea level rise, induced storms, as well as permanent tidal inundation. Over $3 billion in property damages estimated for a 10-year storm in 2040, and over $4 billion of property that is at risk to permanent tidal inundation. We use these different estimates about building loss and loss of function to generate estimates of business and employment impacts. In many cases, our direct property impacts are based on Army Corps of Engineers methods, where our business and employment impacts are developed based on methodologies prescribed by FEMA. Based on that analysis, lost sales, how it results in lost income and lost jobs, again, you see more significant impacts due to sea level rise rather than storms, about 360 jobs at risk to one 10-year storm event, and 720 jobs risk to permanent sea level rise. These numbers do appear conservative, and I just want to clarify the reason that these impacts look low is because in our analysis, we embrace different assumptions about the ability for businesses to recapture, industries to recapture output. You're seeing that to a degree in COVID. I'm happy to speak more to that in Q&A time. And lastly, when you have impacts to property, be it public or private sector, it flows down to resulting in fiscal impacts. We see about $2 million in sales and tourism tax losses from a 10-year storm in 2040. And it grows significantly to about 30 million or 28 million for losses from daily tidal inundation. Can we go to the next slide, please? Once again, these is a representation of these discrete events happening based on conditions in 2070. What you will see is there is a significant increase in impacts to property, business and employment, as well as to public entities that rely on fiscal revenues. I believe it's about 5 times greater impacts across the board for temporary storm damages. We're looking at 16.5 billion from the 10-year storm based on the 2070 conditions. Over 1,300 jobs at risk from this model scenario, and additional 8 million sales and tourism tax losses. And again, our analysis indicates that you face much more significant risk to the impacts of permanent and gradual sea level rise, over $50 billion in exposed property value, nearly 18,000 jobs at risk based on this future condition scenario, and nearly 385 million in fiscal impacts, a majority of those impacts being related to property tax impacts that are no longer being collected by relevant jurisdictions. Can we go to the next slide? So those slides indicate what's at risk if we don't do anything to mitigate the future risks that are presented to us. But we need to understand both what the costs and benefits of taking actions to mitigate those risks. So we modeled 2 distinct adaptation buckets, one we call community-wide, one we call building level. But these are pretty generally accepted and implementable strategies that we're able to scale across the region. Community-wide relies on beach nourishment, berm construction, seawall construction, and building level adaptation is focused on elevating or flood-proofing structures. In our analysis, we want to be clear that we don't expect the counties and the region in general to be investing to protect from 2070 or 2100 now. So we take a phased approach to costing and modeling adaptation where, for example, if a seawall is going to be constructed, we construct it in a manner that leaves a cap so it can be raised in the future. So we take a phased approach to talking about investments and adaptation when they should occur. I also want to mention these are complementary strategies. While we model them in separate buckets, they can be combined and collectively provide additive benefits than what we evaluated. So I want to be clear that there's some nuance when we think about the results on the next slide. Next slide, please. So I showed you earlier just the discrete impacts from a single storm or a future rate of daily tidal inundation. But when we invest in adaptation, as we all know, we're not just investing to protect from those discrete events, but to provide cumulative benefits over time. So we undertook a benefit cost analysis. These are the results we showed on the second slide, where we account for the likelihood of these events occurring, the timing of when these investments are made. And we use different economic and financial techniques to show the collective benefits and costs in present value dollars. And what you can see, community-wide has a benefit cost ratio, which is informed by dividing the benefits by the cost of 2, and building level has a benefit cost ratio of 4. I want to point out though, agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers aren't just focused on benefit cost ratios, they're also focused on the net benefits that are provided to society. And the community-wide adaptation that we modeled has significantly more net benefits than the building level does, and also provides protection in roadways to critical infrastructure, in addition to just houses. I also want to mention that investments in adaptation also result in new employment. And so we use the REMI economic modeling software, which is a sophisticated software that takes into consideration opportunity cost and trade-offs and where money is spent and how to model the net job impacts that could be supported by these investments. Based on our analysis, the community-wide approach provides over 85,000 job years, while the building level provides 56,000. I want to note that one job year can be represented in the graphic. One job times 10 years would be 10 job years. So these are not 85,000 jobs year over year, but these are represented in job years. Next slide, please. I think I'm running out of time, but fundamentally what we see from our analysis that even just protection to direct property is cost effective in at a regional scale in Southeast Florida. We also did some qualitative analysis I mentioned relating to preservation of property values, lower insurance premiums, and protection of property tax revenues, among other things. I won't get into the details on this slide, but there is the potential for these investments in adaptation to provide additional monetary benefits. We see, great, I'm just gonna note. We see that there's a lot of academic studies that are coming out that are kind of telling different stories. Most of these studies are showing that property at higher risk is appreciating at a lower rate than property, comparable property that is not exposed to that risk. There's a recent article in the New York Times a couple days ago. It kind of has some counter results that show there could be some absolute losses related to sea level rise impacts in the future. Lastly, I want to mention before I pass it off to Annie that something that the community-wide adaptation strategy provides beyond protection to property tax revenues is that it maintains the state's and the region's beaches. And this provides a significant economic impact to the region based on the high levels of visitation to Florida's beaches and coast, which has a direct fiscal impact. So that community-wide adaptation, again, not only just protects buildings and roadways and infrastructure, but preserves a really important critical asset that is underpins the economy in the region. With that, I will pass it over to Annie, who's gonna talk about some of our recommendations that we identified. Next slide.
So we have concluded that there is a regional business case for resilience, but in order to implement these investments, it's important to have supporting policies and programs that focus not only on moving from planning to project execution, but also that ensure that future risk can be mitigated and all communities are invested in equitably. So we developed 10 recommendations to help take action now to support effective and equitable outcomes. And these recommendations are based in large part on the amazing amount of work already happening in the region, which has really been showcased during today's events. While some of these actions involve specific key players, such as local government, the real estate industry, or the insurance industry, overall, the findings from the study have demonstrated what, in large part, we already knew, that no one sector can solve this challenge alone. A cross-cutting recommendation is that we must account for equity and address social vulnerability in all that we do. And one reason this is so important to discuss in the context of this presentation specifically is that benefit cost analysis uses conventional financial metrics, such as real estate market values, to determine returns on investment. But using these metrics when deciding where and how to spend money may result in inadequate investment in the frontline communities that we know will disproportionately be impacted by climate change, such as low-income communities and communities of color. Therefore, I really want to bring back what Dr. Holder mentioned earlier on the importance of stories and how qualitative metrics sometimes can provide just as valuable insights as quantitative data can. I'm going to dive deeper into 3 of these recommendations, but more information on these 10 can be found in the accompanying business report, business case that's going to be released today. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So first, I just want to focus on developing actionable funding and financing plans. This has been touched on earlier today of how do we pay for this? And it's a big question. To pay for adaptation, it will be necessary to use really a mix of funding and financing tools, given current budgetary constraints and commitments, as well as the large anticipated expenses of these projects. To help identify what financing tools may be most suitable, there are some key questions to ask, such as whether the proposed investment supports infrastructure for new development, or if the project might generate significant cost savings. Measures similar to Broward County's recent transportation surtax may be best suited to fund regional capital investment like road improvements, and more local sources such as special assessments might be most applicable for projects that provide specific quantifiable benefits to certain properties. In addition to suitability, though, it's critical that any funding strategy also account for the capacity for specific individuals and populations to bear the burden of the anticipated costs. Recommendation 4 is to develop an occupational roadmap to resilience. Some workers may be more vulnerable to coastal hazards, such as workers with less adaptable skill sets, lower wage workers, and workers who travel far to get to work. Many of these workers are subject to the impacts of coastal hazards, work in tourism-related businesses, which are the underpin of the Southeast Florida's economy. These individuals often make close to minimum wage and do not live in the communities where they work. At the same time, it's anticipated that recovery efforts and adaptation investments will favor certain occupations over others, like emergency responders and construction workers. And as has been noted in recent work, such as Resilient 305, the construction industry is already in high demand and has projected impending labor shortages in the region. So it's critical to help professionals understand their vulnerabilities of their industry and provide supporting resources to grow their careers. And lastly, engage with and provide support to the small community. About 90% of firms in the 4-county region have fewer than 20 employees, and the pandemic has illustrated just how vulnerable small businesses are. To engage and support, it's important to provide streamlined access to capital and financing to allow for continued operations and quick recovery. Next slide. So with that, I just want to thank you again for your time and thank the Compact for having us today and hosting this event, which really demonstrates the amazing work that can be accomplished when local, regional, private, and public actors come together to build resilience. As noted earlier, the full report will be released today and will be available on the Compact's website as well as ULI's online portal. We will hold technical questions related to the presentation until after the next panel conversation on the business case analysis. So with that, it's